Melvin, greetings.
Good day.
Tell the people how they can support the podcast.
If you'd like to support the podcast, you can always visit our support page at thelifeofxpodcast.com and click through. It'll let you know how you can help us out.
Yeah, we've got a link to our Patreon page there and to our Audible subscription page and also to our Amazon portal. So we hope to find you there.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Hello and welcome to the podcast. My name is Arif Jadala.
And I'm Melvin Barnes.
And that makes this the Life of X. Melvin, how are you?
I'm doing good. It's rainy, but...
It is a beautiful, rainy December day in beautiful Columbus, Ohio.
Yes, sir.
We are here for part 2 of The Life of Andrew Carnegie.
Carnegie.
Quite a life.
Yeah, so far it's been pretty interesting.
Pretty interesting indeed. Do you have anything to catch us up on, Melvin, in the life of a scholar?
Not really. Just know the life of a scholar seems glamorous, but it's pretty rough.
Is it?
Yeah.
Fantastic. All right, well, before we dive into part 2 of Life of Andrew Carnegie, we would like to say some thank yous to people who have been supporting the podcast in different ways. First, we have Two Ugly Mugs Salsa Company. This is a company that is based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, which is pretty appropriate for Andrew Carnegie, I think.
Mm-hmm.
They sent us some delicious, muggin' hot, habanero-based salsa.
Yeah, sweet, tangy, delicious.
Very good. They are a family-owned salsa company, like I said, based out of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. This was a salsa that they had been making for years after their annual garden canning and harvest. They would just make this salsa, and they said, hey, I bet people would enjoy this. So they started making it and selling it. Sent us some delicious salsa. We have enjoyed it thoroughly.
So if you wanted to buy some of that salsa, where would you go to get it?
You would go to the number 2uglymugs.com. Visit them.
All right. So first order of business after the salsa discussion is we need to shout out our new $5 patron, Jim. Jim's going to receive a thank you note, a sticker, and one of our excellent, and I mean excellent, coffee mugs.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen our coffee mugs, head on over to our Instagram and or Facebook, and we have pictures of them on there.
Mm-hmm.
They are fantastic.
Oh, yeah.
We also would like to acknowledge those of you who have been so kind as to leave us 5-star ratings and write us wonderful, thoughtful reviews in iTunes. The first one comes from Feldman D. The subject is, LOX is amazing. These guys are so great. You can tell they do some serious research into each person. How can you know so much about Will Chamberlain? I don't even know that much about myself. Give LOX a listen if you enjoy smart commentary, great banner, and knowledgeable hosts who keep the conversation fun and interesting. Top notch.
All right, our next review is from J. Cole 1, and it says, a great listen. Have enjoyed listening to Arif and Melvin walk through their first 2 historical figures. They have a great dynamic together, and I'm looking forward to future episodes.
The great rapper J. Cole 1 said that about us.
I know, man. Maybe we'll pop up in a song.
Maybe we will. Now, to catch you up, in case you've forgotten, in the last episode, we talked about Andrew's early years, his travel, his 42-day voyage from Scotland to the United States, his rising through the ranks of the Pennsylvania Railroad Company, to the point now where he and his neighbor, William Coleman, had purchased rights to oil in Pennsylvania and had more or less built a lake of oil, which made them incredibly wealthy individuals. So we're going to pick up in 1861. The Trans-Pacific Railroad was approved, and Andrew sees dollar signs in his future.
So before we move on really quickly, Arif, what was the Trans-Pacific Railroad?
The Trans-Pacific Railroad, Melvin, was a railroad that was supposed to go out west.
So from the East Coast to the West Coast, linking the country, from sea to shining sea. And they met up in what city? St. Louis, the gateway to the West.
There you go. Melvin posed a question and then answered it himself.
That's what we do.
So Trans-Pacific Railroad was set to be built, and Andrew said, you know what? I'm going to make so much money from this, it's going to be disgusting.
But
I'm definitely not going to own a railroad company because I can see that the Civil War has ruined railroad companies, and there is a lot of money to be made in railroad adjacent industries. So he decided that he was going to make his money by selling iron to these railroad companies that needed to rebuild track and needed to rebuild previously wooden bridges.
Could you imagine taking these like heavy train cars over wooden
Rickety
bridges?
wooden bridges.
Just shaking.
Yeah. Not interested.
Yeah, so Carnegie's making his money rebuilding these bridges out of iron. But by 1862, at age 26, Carnegie's actually pretty financially independent. He doesn't need to be, in Pittsburgh the whole time. In fact, he's getting most of his work done in a morning.
By this point, my impression from the book was that he really wasn't even doing anything anymore. He still maintained his job at the Pennsylvania Railroad, but kind of just on paper. And a lot of that was because, and we'll see how this plays out a little bit later, probably in like a minute. He was doing that because at the time, because the railroads were so important to the war effort, Lincoln had exempted railroad personnel from the draft when they started drafting people to the Union Army.
Ah, good old draft dodger.
Exactly. So he's making all this money. Again, we already established in the last episode that he wasn't a great manager of people. So he didn't do that either. He actually, around this time, began this lifelong pattern that he had of appointing people to just take care of all of his affairs and then bouncing.
Like, I'm going to go travel. You do my work. I'm going to London.
Yeah, man. He had that financial freedom, so he said, I'm going to use it.
Yeah. So in 1862, he and his mother actually traveled back to first London and then eventually back to their hometown, Dunfermline.
Yeah. And, Nasaw really points out in the book that Andrew had these idyllic memories of Dunfermline. It was, I feel like a lot of people get that with their hometown when their children, the place where you grew up and everything like that.
Yo, Toledo's still great.
Listen, I personally still really enjoy going back to Youngstown, but Andrew found that he had, quote unquote, outgrown Dunfermline. He much preferred the company of the intellectuals of London.
I tell you what, man, I pray that the day comes where I have enough money to go back to Toledo and just be like, you know what? This is beneath me now.
Peons.
But also, the trip back was not all that great because he mostly just shows up and gets really sick.
Yeah. I think it was in Dunfermline when they were rounding out their trip. He just totally racked by some sickness. I forget what it was, but it's funny. Obviously, he gets sick more than once in his life. But it's crazy to think about reading this book that when you got sick at this time, it was almost always life-threatening.
Oh, yeah. One thing that I remember, there was some other guy in the book that dies at like 58. They're like a relatively old age.
I think it was Andrew's dad.
Yeah. Those were different times.
Yeah, man. If someone dies at 58 now, it's like a tragedy.
So, yeah, but eventually he recovers and makes it back home. But by the end of 1863, he's a wealthy dude. He's worth a whole $47,000, which is how much in 2018 doll hairs?
It's always kind of rough to calculate that, but I'm just going to go with Nassau's estimate, which he has like a whole footnote about how he did it, and he more or less does the equivalent of like spending power. Mm-hmm. So $47,000 in 1863 dollars was roughly $8.5 million today.
Not bad for a broke kid from Dunfermline.
That's right. Doing pretty darn good. And most of his wealth is from Columbia and Pennsylvania Railroad adjacent companies. So, we talked last episode about his principles of investing and knowing people and making sure you understand that what you're doing is more or less a sure thing. And especially in the instance of the Pennsylvania Railroad, he and Tom Scott had a really good relationship, and he still worked for the Pennsylvania Railroad. So he kind of knew what the Pennsylvania Railroad was going to do and how those decisions would affect his adjacent investments. And so he was making a ton of money.
But life has a way of kind of throwing you curveballs.
Unless you're rich.
Right. We'll get to that. So in 1864, in 1864, Andrew gets drafted. His worst nightmare comes true. So he does what any very wealthy person would do in 1864 when you got drafted. You pay someone to go in your place.
That's right. He paid a man named John Lindu $850, which was a pretty penny.
He couldn't throw him $1,000.
I'm just saying, $850 was probably a lot of money. I'm not going to do the math right now, but it was like a 15-time multiplier or something like that.
You got 47 thousands of thousand. You can toss a guy $1,000.
I guess. But anyway, John Lindu was apparently happy with that 850 and took it.
I wonder, do we know if he survived?
No.
I don't think they mentioned it.
No, we don't.
Probably dead.
He probably didn't survive. But his family got that money.
That's true.
A fair trade-off?
I would definitely give up a kid for $850.
Wow. Goodness, I'm leaving that in.
Leave it in.
Anyway, so that was so dark. So we're going to move on now and talk about Union Iron, which is kind of the company that Andrew Carnegie is associated with now. And they have a pretty interesting origin story, I thought. And this is kind of one of those Andrew is playing 3D chess while everyone else is playing checkers.
Pause. Can we get into this and just ask real quick before we start? Was this dirty?
I don't think it was dirty. I definitely think it was Machiavellian.
So dirty.
No, I don't know. I mean,
let's get into it. We'll let the listeners decide.
Yeah, listener, you can decide if this was dirty. Okay. So we need to introduce a couple characters real quick before we dive into the forming of the Union Iron Company. So there's Thomas Miller, who's a close friend of Andrew's. And there's also a guy named Henry Phipps, who was also a friend of Andrew and Tom Carnegie. Actually, it's kind of interesting how things worked out that when they first moved to Allegheny City, Mag, Andrew and Tom's mother, actually worked for Henry Phipps' father. He was like a cobbler. And so Mag was like doing the binding for the shoes for him. And so they all became friends and maintained their friendship. So Thomas Miller, Henry Phipps, and these two brothers named Cloman, the Cloman brothers, they started the Iron City Forge in Pittsburgh to take advantage of the growing need for iron during the Civil War. That was in 1861. Miller bought out one of the Cloman brothers almost immediately. Phipps and Miller then found out that the remaining Cloman brother from the deal had sold a 1/9 share to a local man who died during the war. Miller finds that guy's family, buys that share, raising his share in the Iron City Forge to 4/9. The three men were soon at odds with each other because they each wanted to buy the others out, but no one else would budge. So they say, hey, we know a guy with an impeccable reputation, an honest and good man, Andrew Carnegie. They go to him and they say, hey, Andrew, come and mediate. September 1st, 1863, Carnegie drew up these incorporation papers, which made Miller a silent partner and made Tom Carnegie, just out of nowhere, brings him in, a partner in the business as well, which was financed by Andrew, who had all that money.
It's kind of interesting. It's just like, you know what? You know what you guys need? My brother.
That's right.
Bring my brother in.
You need Tom Carnegie.
Right.
Andrew, where did Tom get all this money? Don't worry about it. So anyway, Tom is now a partner in this new agreement, incorporation.
We were having a problem with the number of partners that we already had, so we added another one.
Exactly. Andrew also included in this contract a clause that allowed Phipps and Cloman to oust Miller and make him a silent partner, which basically just meant that he was no longer involved in any decision-making. Gave him that Steve Jobs. And and they took advantage of that immediately. That same clause allowed Tom Carnegie to purchase the extra 1/9 share that Miller held, which he immediately did with, again, Andrew's money.
Now, Miller was not happy with the deal and how it worked out. So what he does is he decides, I'm going to start my own company. And I don't know where he got this name, but he calls his company, which he starts in October of 1864, Cyclops Iron.
That's weird.
Yeah, I don't know why you would call it Cyclops.
Mythic.
But I think Iron City was pretty good.
That's really good.
Now, no one was happy with this arrangement. Why? Because Carnegie doesn't like competition.
Yeah, Tom Carnegie doesn't like competition. None of these other guys like competition. We are monopolists, darn it.
So what Tom via Andrew does is they offer to buy out everybody. So they just basically paid everybody off for $50,000, an enormous amount of money.
Tom's already at Iron City. He buys the other two guys out. Then he buys Miller out over at Cyclops. And for like the price of whatever their shares were, plus an additional $50,000, which was got to be close to $9 million or something like that in today's money, if Nasaw's numbers were correct.
Now they bring everything together under the name Union Iron Mills Company, and they did this in May 1st, 1865. This was formed with Andrew as the president and Tom as the vice president, but Tom is the one who's actually running the day-to-day operations because Andrew has decided he's going to head back overseas and gallivant across Europe.
Yeah, I just think it's funny that technically Andrew wasn't involved in this
at all,
and in either of these companies whatsoever. And then when it's finally all finished in one company, he's suddenly the president.
This is what we were talking about when we were talking about 3D chess.
And I don't think it's dirty. Like I said, I just think it's Machiavellian.
You know, I would agree. I wouldn't say it's dirty because everybody else got their money.
And they all signed these documents.
Right. They got paid off.
That's right.
I mean, if you show the money, then I guess it's okay.
Yeah. So anyway, at age 30 in 1865, Andrew rolling in that dough and president of Union Iron.
Now, Andrew in 1865, his income was roughly $5.6 million today. Now, is that annual income?
Yeah.
That's pretty good.
That's every year. The dude is just gallivanting around Europe and watching that money roll in.
Yeah. What a good capitalist. So he did. He wanted to see Europe. So Henry Phipps. So things couldn't have been that bad because he's still rolling around with Phipps.
Oh, yeah. They're still friends.
Right.
Everyone's rich and happy.
Right. And John Vandy, how do you say Vandervoort?
Vandervoort.
Took a year-long trip to Europe. God, I wish I just had enough money to just say, you know what? I'm going to walk away for a while. You know what, guys? Just keep doing my work. I'm going to go to Europe and
chill.
Yeah, just hang out.
It's funny to think about, though, that I also believe that taking a nice, long, extended vacation somewhere would be wonderful. But then I always think about how long it probably took to travel. So by this point, I'm sure it didn't take 42 days, but it's still not a quick flight across the ocean.
But we don't want to give you the impression that Andrew and his crew are struggling out here. So they get to Europe and they're hiking from city to city, but they're living in the lap of luxury as they're doing this.
Andrew, in his writing back home, he painted this as this like vigorous,
rough hiking through the backwoods
of Europe, which, I mean, listen, the dude was walking between cities. So, I mean, like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of movement happening here, but he's also traveling with like a full entourage of people to keep them comfortable. And when they stayed for the night, they were in like luxury hotels and they would stop in each city and soak up the culture. It actually sounds like a great time.
Right. And you know what? The first, I think on this trip, which seemed to go a lot better than their last trip, there was like, he said there wasn't even rain. They just had great weather and just soaked it up, ate great food, and had a good time.
So Andrew, like we said, had a great time in Europe. He's 31 years old, and up to this point, according to Nasaw and according to Andrew's own writing, really didn't have any interest in marriage, which was kind of unusual for a wealthy individual at his age during this time. Nasaw kind of speculates that a lot of this had to do with the fact that he was such a mama's boy, and he didn't want to be separated from Mag. He didn't want to have to worry about finding a woman who Mag would approve of and all that. But anyway, when he gets done in Europe, he heads back to Pittsburgh and he finds a much quieter city. Like we'd already mentioned, the Civil War had been crazy for industry. And so there was a lot of producing, which led to a lot more pollution and a lot more people in Pittsburgh. And so by the time he returned in 1866, it was quieter, but it was still dirty. Now, at the top of the episode, we mentioned the fact that the Trans-Pacific Railroad was getting ready to be built, and this would, in the next 50 years, spell a gigantic economic boom for the United States. It really opened up the entire country. And at this time, railroad owners saw that they needed to repair their rails. Most of them had been built on really cheap iron rails, and the war had really done a number on them. And so people were looking to steel. At this time, it was kind of new, but people could kind of see that steel was going to be the answer to replacing these rails, but steel rails were really expensive. So Andrew, while in Europe, was like, I'm brilliant. I'm going to find the answer to this.
Yeah, so in Europe, they had some advanced steel technology. Now, a lot of the rails that they used in the United States were actually cheap iron that we had imported from Europe. But there was one individual that he ran into in Europe that brought to his attention what they called the Dodd process, which is a way to take iron and to actually coat it with a layer of steel, which would naturally make the product much more durable.
In theory.
In theory. And while in Europe, Carnegie decides that this is a process that they need to implement back home in his ironworks in Pittsburgh. And that would give them a leg up on the companies that they would be competing with as they worked to rebuild the, United States rail infrastructure. And there was only one problem, and that is that after spending all of this money, it becomes very clear that the patent that Carnegie had purchased was mostly worthless. They tested the process back home, and it didn't actually yield positive results. But rather than admit there was a problem here, Andrew asked them to test it again, but in the meantime, he actually looks up another process that was supposed to improve upon the process in which he'd already purchased a patent for, and that process as well failed to actually produce a more durable product.
So Andrew was just running around, failing left and right.
Right. It just literally spending the equivalent of millions of dollars today to purchase these patents.
And if I recall correctly, Tom Carnegie was like, please pump the brakes.
Yeah, his brother back home is trying to explain to him that, like, listen, these tests are going bad, and these patents that you are purchasing are worthless. And this, I think, was the first time for Tom that he starts to realize that maybe Andrew's decision making isn't perfect.
But whatever. Andrew had the money, and it was his money to throw around. But anyway, that company that he started to try to do the Dodd process and these other ones that weren't good, I shouldn't say immediately, only took about a year before it failed and they shuttered the windows.
Yeah. Must be nice to have enough money where you can start a business and fail and think, meh.
So this takes us into 1867, where Andrew just continued to be the capitalist that he was and growing his holdings. He invested in the Keystone Bridge Company and the Central Transportation Company, the CTC. Now, CTC's main competition was the luxurious Pullman sleeping car company, which some of you may be familiar with. But the CTC was like a lower level standard sleeping compartment company, and Pullmans were super luxurious. And Andrew wanted that. He wanted that company bad, or at least a piece of it. And so he found that Pullman had infringed on several of the CTC's patents. And he didn't want a legal battle, like I said. He just wanted a chunk of the company. And Pullman was not about that. But Pullman didn't really want a legal battle either. And so it took a lot of hemming and hawing and fighting and whatnot. But Andrew eventually got what he wanted, a piece of the company. He then used his connections at the Pennsylvania Railroad to get a lot of sweetheart deals for the Pullman Company, which further enriched himself.
During this time, Andrew traveled almost constantly while securing bridge contracts. He's traveling so much that he doesn't even have a permanent residence, right?
Right.
He's living in different hotels, and he actually stayed at two different hotels, one in Pittsburgh and New York. But he's not traveling by himself. He has a small, would you call it an entourage?
Of course I would call it an entourage.
Of Tom, his wife, Lucy, and Mag.
I have to interrupt. So Tom, his wife Lucy, and Mag all stayed at Homewood.
Oh, yeah.
Anyway, it's their
countryside home.
Yeah, exactly. Their country estate. And so Tom, Lucy, and Mag all live together there. Andrew is going city to city, talking to these
big wigs.
Yeah, talking like, hey, listen, you got a railroad, I got a bridge.
Let's do something.
That's right. So Andrew continues to travel around, securing these bridge contracts, becoming even more fabulously wealthy. December 1868, at the age of 33, Nasaw says that he was worth $400,000 then. That's $75 million in today's dollars, and had an annual income of $50,000, which is roughly $8 million today. So he's doing real good. And he says, you know what? I love money, but I also would like to become a man of letters. I want to be an intellectual. And so he decides to devote the next 5 years to transitioning away from money and begin working toward a new chapter of education and self-improvement.
Now, I'm going to tell you, as a graduate student, that was a mistake.
Well, no.
He doesn't get far away from...
You're doing it in the wrong order, Melvin. He did it in the correct order.
Yeah.
Fabulous wealth first, then worry about the mind.
That's a good point.
It's also interesting, too, to note that at this point, apparently, Andrew had begun writing about his desire to help the poor. And the reason that this is interesting now is because later, when there are these problems with labor unions and, some pretty violent strike breaking that Andrew is involved in, there are allegations that he only became a philanthropist to kind of try to recover his image. And, Nasaw kind of points to the writing around this period saying that, no, Andrew was already talking about giving away large pieces of his wealth this early on. He developed a plan. It was a 5-year plan. And he said, he wrote it all out. He planned to spend the next 2 years earning and engaging in a rigorous course of self-study. Then, at 35, he would enroll at Oxford, where he would study, hang out with intellectuals, and hone his public speaking skills. By 40, he wanted to be settled in London and buy and manage a newspaper. What's interesting is that in this 5-year plan that was going to take him through his 40th birthday, he never once mentioned a wife or a family. So Nasaw kind of again points to this as saying that like maybe it was Mag, maybe it was just he was disinterested at this point. I kind of got the impression too that at the time it seemed like once you were married and you had a family, the expectation was that you kind of settle. And Andrew didn't want to settle. He wanted to go around. He was globetrotting.
Mm-hmm.
But anyway, that plan that would never come to pass, but Andrew carried it with him, the little piece of paper that he wrote it on, until the day he died, and basically lived by the principles outlined in that paper for the rest of his life.
Yeah. So that brings us up to 1872, when Andrew is featured in this article. The headline was, Mr. Carnegie is now 35 years of age and is said to be worth $1 million of dollars.
I'm a big fan of that
Of dollars.
That's right.
Yeah. So at this point in time, he's still popping back and forth between the United States and England. And he's in London, and he's really pushing these railroad bonds, in part because people in Europe are buying.
Yeah, and so real quick, 2 things about his trip to London I thought it was interesting. We mentioned before this voyage taking 42 days when he got to the United States from Scotland. This trip was on the Cunard Line's first steamship, and it only took 8 days. So he is seeing the evolution of transportation.
Yeah, that's got to be like going from the 8-day trip to like a plane where I get there in 6-8 hours now.
Yeah, crazy. But real quick too, for those of you who are not familiar with how the whole bond process worked, at the time when a company wanted to finance something instead of selling equity in their company or whatever, they would just go to some wealthy people. They'd find people with money and say, hey, I want to sell you a bond. And what that means is that you're going to give me cash now. I'm going to give you this certificate that will accrue this agreed upon amount of interest over this amount of time. And when it's done, you can give it back to me and I will give you the money that you gave me plus whatever interest we agreed to. And so that's what he's doing in Europe at this time. He is selling bonds for this railroad company.
Now, when he gets back, he decides that he and his mother are going to leave wherever, where Pittsburgh,
Homewood. I feel like Mag probably spent most of her time
at
Homewood, and he was probably more in Pittsburgh/New York City when he was around.
Now, they moved to New York City, and in moving to New York City, they don't buy a house or a penthouse apartment. What they do is they stay in these fancy hotels that are aiming at having rich people just live in them indefinitely.
Yeah, I mean, the lifestyle, it sounded like to me, was more or less as if you had just bought like a fancy apartment and like a staff of people to wait on you.
Yeah.
So it was like, hey.
Just imagine you go to one of the nicest hotels in downtown New York and
buy
just
a floor.
just get a suite and you just live there. Like you always have room service.
They have these like super fancy dining rooms where they had all their meals, and like the residents of these fancy New York apartments all had designated tables. And so it was a way for him to kind of take in the culture that he wanted in New York and also kind of mingle with other wealthy and influential people who also happen to live in some of these fancy New York hotels.
Yeah, so he's in New York, popping in back and forth between New York City and London, and he's selling these bonds, a lot of it probably in less than ethical ways. So, I mean, the lack of ethics probably comes from him just blatantly lying about the potential to actually get their money back out of these investments.
I didn't get the impression that he was like blatantly lying.
Was he overselling?
Yeah, that was the impression that I got from Nasaw anyway, that it was more an oversell than, he was talking about things as if they were already happening that had not yet happened.
But this business that he has, going back and forth between London and New York City, runs up against a political problem, which was the Alabama claims incident.
Real quick, before we do that, I just want to mention that the bank that he was working with primarily in Europe was run by one Junius Spencer Morgan, J.S. Morgan. Some of you may recognize the initials J.P. Morgan, who will come into play later, but Junius was his father. He was an American banker and financier. He founded the J.S. Morgan and Company along with a man named George Peabody, and he had moved to London where he was a big-time banker and power broker, and he served as the international wing of this bank while J.P., his son, ran the same. I think actually it might have been a different company, but they were basically
Connected.
basically the same company. I believe they were in Philadelphia, if I am remembering correctly. But anyway, so that's who he was working closely with, selling a lot of these bonds to in London. But anyway, please pick up with the Alabama claims incident.
So the Alabama claims incident was basically the United States explaining to Great Britain that they were very upset with Britain's conduct during the American Civil War. The British had supplied the Confederate States with iron-built ships that they had constructed in British shipyards. And the United States government was, in a sense, saying, we are demanding reparations for you helping the Confederate States sink some of our commerce ships, because obviously the Confederates used these ships to attack the North. And the United States was looking to get some money for damages. And Andrew, during this time, tried to broker some sort of peace between these two governments. I don't know how much weight his name carried.
Let me tell you something. If Dennis Rodman can be a peace broker now, Andrew Carnegie can be a peace broker then.
Yeah, you know what? That is a very good point. So this is kind of the beginning of Andrew's interest in promoting world peace. You know, he really gets a sort of close look at international politics and the potential ramifications of this, because this could have turned into something much bigger than it actually
Could
did.
have turned to another war.
Right.
And for Andrew, the Alabama claims incident was also significant because it kind of forced him into a semi-retirement. You know, while this was going on, it wasn't really safe for him to travel back to the United States. And so he was kind of stuck in Europe. And he just took to being semi-retired and being a man of leisure. And he really liked it. And Nasaw kind of marks this as the last time that Andrew would ever work full-time again. So anyway, he heads back to the United States once the Alabama claims incident was brokered and fine. And he really enjoyed selling those bonds in Europe, but he was kind of feeling the pressure. It was a lot for him to juggle. By this point, he had become like the single point of failure, I guess, for these bridge companies and iron companies and that sort of thing in the United States and the financiers in Europe. So it was just becoming a lot for him. Also, by the time he got back, this was the fall of 1872. I actually don't recall if I just mentioned that or not. But anyway, that's when it was. He had a bunch of cash and he was itching to get into it. So there was a lot for him to consider. He looked into oil, but he decided that Rockefeller was already colonizing all of the oil in Pennsylvania, and he actually considered it a speculative investment at this point. Iron furnaces, iron mills, bridge building, all doing great, but he wanted higher returns. So he turned to steel. One thing that influenced his decision was that the Republican Congress had imposed a $28 per ton tariff on imported steel. So the American market was wide open. Up to this point, a lot of people had been importing steel from Europe, and that was going to come to an end, or at least it was going to be reduced. So Andrew decides to form a steel company in Pittsburgh, and he, as was his wont, was rarely there, leaving it to others to sort of run. Everything was going great. He was making a ton of money, and then the bankruptcy of J. Cook and Company went off on September 18th, 1873. And this would actually touch off the Panic of 1873.
Now, this was one of those instances, right, where this was like a company that seemed, for the time, too big to fail, right? Where it failing just kind of scared the mess out of a bunch of other people, right?
Yeah, so my impression from reading Nassaw's book and then the Wikipedia page for the Panic of 1873, my impression is that this bank was one of the largest, most well-respected banks in the United States. And there were a lot of economic factors. Like the economy was not actually that great. People were kind of misbehaving, I guess you could say. And this just was like a crisis of confidence, and it more or less started this crash. So I'm actually just going to read, I know how much listeners love that, but the first couple paragraphs from the Panic of 1873 Wikipedia page, because I feel like it's relatively succinct. So.
Okay. Well, I'll actually take the first one if you want.
Oh, well, go ahead.
The Panic of 1873 was a financial crisis that triggered a depression in Europe and North America that lasted from 1873 until 1879, and even longer in some countries, France and Britain. In Britain, for example, it started 2 decades of stagnation known as the Long Depression that weakened the country's economic leadership. In the United States, the panic was known as the Great Depression, until the events of the early 1930s set a new standard.
The Greater Depression.
The greatest of depression.
The Panic of 1873 and the subsequent depression had several underlying causes, of which economic historians debate the relative importance. American post-Civil War inflation, rampant speculative investments overwhelmingly in railroads, the demonetization of silver in Germany and the United States, ripples from economic dislocation in Europe resulting from the Franco-Prussian War, property losses in Chicago and Boston, fires, and other factors put a massive strain on bank reserves, which plummeted in New York City in September and October 1873 from 50 million to 17 million.
How big were these fires to be included in this? Like, that was a heck of a fire.
Didn't they like burn the whole city? I thought, if I recall correctly, we can click over.
Maybe there's a president fiddling on the roof.
The Great Chicago Fire was a conflagration that burned from Sunday, October 8th to Tuesday, October 10th. Can you imagine that? Just 2 days of just
fire
burning. And we're not talking about like, we see these California wildfires. This is Chicago.
This is a city, right? Where you're like, boy, I hope that fire doesn't hit my house.
And then it does.
Yep.
Yeah.
And then the bank's out of money. Ain't no FEMA back then.
It said the fire killed 300 people, left more than 100,000 homeless. So big fires. Leave it at that. And when Jay Cook and Company went down, we said this triggered the panic, but the effects were immediate. The stock exchange closed on the 20th of September and stayed closed for 10 days. And also, banks had loaned a ton of money out, mostly to railroads. So they called those loans in immediately. They're like, we need our money now. And they also, were like, also, if you're going to borrow any money from us, you're paying a pretty penny in interest. So a lot of these railroads were just completely frozen. And like we mentioned, Andrew's money was coming from companies that were railroad adjacent. And so he was hurt by this pretty bad too.
Yeah, so during this period in time, Andrew just has to tighten the belt. He's no longer worried about prospering. He's now worried about surviving. And surviving, I guess, means staying rich. So he starts to just do what he can to fortify the core of his investments that protect the most important of his businesses, which are Lucy Furnace, Union Iron Mills, and the Keystone Bridge Company.
If I recall correctly, that Lucy Furnace is named after Tom's wife.
Ah, that's right.
Which is why it's called Lucy.
Yeah, so he's just saying, we got to weather this storm, keep the most important businesses and investments intact, and we'll go from there once this blows over.
Yeah, and in the process, one casualty of the panic was his relationship with Tom Scott. I don't remember the specifics of the deal that kind of soured their relationship, but Tom Scott, who was an older man, ended up passing away before they could ever reconcile, and it was something that Andrew regretted until the day that he died.
Well, I think what happened was one of Scott's businesses, he needed Carnegie to sign off on some bonds or something like that, and if it came out that Scott was unable to actually pay back the money that he owed, then Carnegie would have been responsible. And he refused to take up that responsibility, and basically that ruined their friendship from there, which, like you said, Andrew seemed to regret moving forward. I don't think he regretted not co-signing, but I think he just regretted not fixing that before Scott.
Yeah, not reconciling. Because, Scott was really who started his ascent. If you remember, it was Scott that Andrew kind of latched onto his coattails and rode through the ranks of the Pennsylvania Railroad to begin with.
So once the panic blows over, it's 1874, Carnegie moves back to New York City, and he's living in one of these luxury hotel apartments across from his favorite feature in the city, Central Park, where he's frequently meeting with young women.
Marriageable women.
Yeah, and riding horses through the park, though he's not married. And
he's courting.
Yeah, he's courting. And, during this time, he's also building up his, this desire to be, again, more literate. He's chasing the books. So what he does is he meets up with this young lady named Madame Anna, how do we pronounce this? Anna Bada? I like Anna Bada. She was an American poet, writer, teacher, and socialite. Now, he joins her literary salon. She instructs him in the ways of reading literature and being literate.
Yeah, among the, what would you call them? The literati.
Yeah, the cultured society.
Right. So I guess my impression of the scene at the time was that this is where New York's intellectuals congregated to talk about whatever intellectuals talk about and debate intellectual things. And so that was important to him. This was the place to be. But he was kind of an anomaly because at the time, business people and the
Intellectuals.
intellectual socialites, they did not mesh.
Yeah, those were different worlds.
Yeah, and so he was kind of an anomaly in that he, under her guidance, kind of fit in and was welcomed. As we'd mentioned when we were talking about Andrew returning from Europe and being a successful bond salesman, he was looking to get into steel. So he started the Edgar Thomson Steelworks at Braddock, Pennsylvania. Now, he named it Edgar Thomson after a man who he knew from his days at the Pennsylvania Railroad. Thomson was a renowned figure at this point. He was responsible for leading the Pennsylvania Railroad to becoming the largest railroad in the United States. His name carried a lot of weight. And so, although he wasn't actually involved with the steelworks, Carnegie asked if he could use the name to kind of lend legitimacy to the operation. He agreed, and so it was named the Edgar Thomson Steelworks at Braddock. Most American steel mills at this point had been iron mills that were just repurposed to make steel. Carnegie was starting fresh. He had given his builder, whose name was Alexander Hawley, who was an American mechanical engineer, inventor, and founding member of the American Society of Mechanical Engineers. He was considered the foremost builder of steel mills and industrial manufacturing facilities just in general. He was known for being able to lay out these places in a way that enabled whatever was being produced to be produced as efficiently as possible. And so Andrew had hired him, and he had just given him more or less a blank slate. He had given him a bare plot of land, 106 acres, which was roughly 100 football fields, and told him to design it to maximum efficiency. And that's exactly what he did. He laid out the transportation grid first so that everything could be shipped in and moved exactly how it was supposed to and exactly how it needed to.
So George Thurston, who published one of the many centennial histories of Pittsburgh that appeared in 1876, described the mill in this way. These works, standing on the very area of a famous frontier battle, are a striking illustration of the conquest of trade, the progress of civilization, and yet more so of the progress of the growth of Pittsburgh. Sounds like the city on the hill.
Yeah, he continues. No grander monument to the growth of the nation, the progress of the city, or the triumph of American manufacturers and of American mechanics could well be built than this complete and comprehensive steelworks. So, people from the community viewed this as a real triumph and a bright spot for the city. By the time they were ready to send their first batch of steel rails and whatever out, it was the mid-1870s. And this was not a great time for American steel, but that's when it was ready to go. And Andrew had to do some deal cutting, not so much for his benefit, but for these railroads, which of course he did benefit from. They were still cash poor. A lot of these railroads, like we said, had been deeply hurt by the first Great Depression, I guess we can call it the panic, but they didn't have cash. And so what they didn't have cash, but they needed steel rails. They had no means to make money because their rails were in disrepair. So what they ended up doing was selling Andrew shares of their company to finance and pay for their new rails. And so Andrew, while producing the steel, was actually taking equity from these companies.
Another thing, I may be getting a little bit ahead of myself, but during this time, doesn't Andrew stress to the people that work for him that you have to accept some of these rail companies don't have a whole lot of money, but we need to accept, contracts anyway? Because unlike a lot of the other capitalists at the time and industrialists, if the deal was not lucrative enough, they just wouldn't accept it. But Andrew stressed that we accept all the deals that we can, and that it's better to actually keep the place moving, keep people working, than to shut down the factory or half a shift or something like that.
Yeah, so it seemed to me that common practice at the time was that if prices weren't high enough for these industrialists to make what they considered good enough money, rather than wasting their resources and taking a lower profit, they would just shut down. And that was also the attitude that a lot of them had when it came to labor. If, labor wasn't going to work for the wages that they thought were appropriate on the shifts that they thought were appropriate, they would just shut down. And Andrew always had the attitude that it's much better to keep the unions happy and working to an extent, and also to just take these contracts and get this business so that when the price goes up, we've already got the contracts. Like, we've already got their business. They already trust us. They already like us. So,
yeah.
And it was a philosophy that paid off.
Yeah, because, during this time, like we said, it's already a tough time for steel and some of these railroads. And some of the other industrialists really struggled with labor uprisings. And what Andrew did that, it didn't always work out perfectly, but it, I think, helped him weather the storm was he developed a sort of sliding scale of compensation for his workers because he looked at the workers as a commodity in and of themselves and he wanted to have the best of whatever he could. So he, would say, okay, well, profits are down, so I need my workers to accept lower pay. But it was set at a sort of, I don't know if you would call it a minimum wage. So they would say, like, if profits are down this much, then we can reduce your pay to this much. And it was a sort of sliding scale.
Yeah, and that's something he doesn't implement for a few more years, and we'll definitely get there because that's a sticking point. But he does adopt a sliding scale for his labor later on. Right now, he is, though, accepting as many steel contracts as he can to keep bringing in some business, even if it's kind of at a loss to himself. He had also become a controlling partner in the Edgar Thomson Steelworks because during the Panic of 1873, even though his cash was, lower than it was, he still had more cash than most. And so he started buying out his partners. And, there were some hard feelings about this after the fact, but I mean, he made the offer and they accepted it. So
one more note while we're on the theme of Carnegie being some sort of predator. We're going to talk about labor practices at the time. Now, basically in the late 19th century, it would have been horrible to be a worker. You had very little rights and the companies took advantage of you left and right. And Carnegie was...
Well, that's why there were labor unions. I feel like labor unions nowadays are more scarce, certainly.
Yeah. Absolutely.
Than they were then. But I really think that at this time, you needed labor unions. Because at this time, we'll just use Carnegie as an example, the owners had all of the power. And if they needed to shut you down for however long, that's what they did. If they needed you to take a wage cut,
And if they wanted you to work 12 hours, you work 12 hours. Now, Carnegie probably wasn't the worst of these capitalists and industrialists.
I would say it was probably the best, actually.
From what we get from the biography, his workers made out pretty well. And I think that comes from his desire to sort of have good labor, right? Yeah. He says if you want to have the best of something, you have to pay for it.
And also not to shut down. Again, this kind of goes back to his philosophy of always producing and, regardless of price, he didn't want these shutdowns pretty much at all costs. And so we'll see as we go forward, Carnegie kind of gets a soft reputation almost among labor unions because he just kind of always gives in to their demands.
Let's not get it twisted. This is still a get down and lay down type situation.
Yeah, and we'll see that too, that when things come to blows, I guess you could say, Andrew kind of puts his foot down.
Yeah.
But anyway, we'll move on from that for the time being. We'll revisit that, as we said. One thing that Carnegie gets remembered for nowadays is his philanthropy. And most people think of him as engaging in philanthropy later in his life, which is certainly when he did the majority of it. But even, around the time he turned 40, he was already giving smaller sums to different charities and that sort of thing. And again, this is kind of like a theme that Nasaw brings up again and again throughout his biographies. He wants to point out that Carnegie was legitimately interested in philanthropy throughout his entire life and not just to try to, resurrect an image towards the end of his life. One of the first things that he did that Nasaw points out is the Carnegie Baths in Dunfermline in 1874 was more or less just like a recreational area back in his hometown. He was a big fan of leisure. He was not one to espouse the virtues of the Protestant work ethic.
This is the thing that I like about him most, right? Because I think a lot of people get rich and just assume it's like, well, I just outworked everybody. And Carnegie was like, no, I don't work hard.
No, I mean, I don't think he would have told you that he didn't work hard in the beginning because when he was rising through the ranks and stuff like that, I'm sure he did. And we talked about how he held people to an extremely high standard, which was basically just the standard that he held himself. But he wasn't going to feed you a line about being a hard worker at this point in his life.
Well, no, I mean, he discussed that he thought a major part of his success was simply being in the right place at the right time. And it wasn't that you were just going to work 26 hours a day and then suddenly you're successful.
Yeah, I mean, I would say he was definitely very self-aware in that regard, that, he recognized the great fortune that he had in bumping into the right people and having the right coattails to latch on to.
And I think a big difference is that he actually, at a point in his life, worked with his hands.
Mm-hmm.
So he understood that you can spend 12, 14 hours a day being a bobbins boy, and working with your hands all day and make next to nothing. Or you can spend 3 hours a day or 4 hours a day, like he's doing later in his life, and make millions.
Yeah. And so he's really enjoying his wealth and being a man of leisure. And he spent a lot of money on books and on journals and on poetry. And it's interesting to think of today, books can still get expensive. I think Melvin can attest to that. But, at the time, they were way more expensive.
They weren't easy to get a hold of.
No. And, academic journal subscriptions today, very expensive, I would say, but way more expensive then. And Andrew used a lot of his wealth to buy journals, buy books, really become more and more literary. He also had an incredible memory.
Yeah, he had a talent for memorizing poetry.
Yeah, and apparently just like anything, but like he loved poetry, and so he could just rattle off long poems, word for word.
And he would all the time.
The time.
And the best part is that he would do these in like business meetings or letters and things like that. But he'd never tell anyone that, oh, this is Chaucer. He would just say it, and then people would say like, man, that's pretty profound.
I made that up.
Yeah, I just came up with that.
Off the dome.
But he also decided to break into something that was very popular around the world at this time, which was travel writing.
Yeah, he really wanted to be seen as a serious writer. And at the time, as a man of means, one of the easiest ways to do so was to write about places that most people would never see. And that's actually the strategy that one Mark Twain used to break into a serious literary career as well.
So one of the initial places that he goes when he starts to pursue this early writing career is he travels to China, Japan, Hong Kong, and I also think he was passing through Singapore as well, which, nowadays I think about how hard it is to travel to China. I can't imagine in 1878 getting on a boat and saying like, yeah, I'm going to China.
But it was probably like a yacht.
It was I was just talking to someone about this, about the Titanic, and how it actually wasn't all that luxurious.
But for the time. I mean, you have to
for the time
have,
it was...
Have some historical context, Melvin.
For the time, it was amazing. But, again, I don't think it was that dope.
Well, yeah, I mean, like, we live better than, like, 13th century kings.
Yeah, obviously, yes. But point being, he travels to China, Japan, and Hong Kong with one of his close friends, Vanderbilt. And he has an absolute ball moving between Tokyo and Hong Kong and Singapore.
And I thought it was interesting, too, and kind of funny that, in his travel notes and this travel writing that he does that eventually he goes on to publish, he really writes about it as almost a Western explorer exploring the Far East. But Nasaw points out that everything he did while he was in Asia, he was waited on by English-speaking people. He stayed at hotels that were like towards English-speaking people and all that. So
yeah. I mean, even today, most people, you show up in Shanghai and you're not wading into the countryside or going out and, spending all this time, living life like Chinese people live.
Right. He's not embedded in the culture.
The interesting thing is, though, he made some observations in this book that he would publish, Notes on a Trip Round the World, which was published in fall of 1879. And he talked about Chinese culture. And, one thing that's interesting is that he didn't lean on the sort of what we'd call racist tropes that were really popular about Chinese at the time. He really talked up the age of the Chinese culture and society, although he did really lament the life that Chinese women led in the late 19th century.
And when he finished these notes, finished his travels, got back to the U.S., published this, like Melvin said, in his book, Notes on a Trip Around the World. And what do you do when you publish a book?
Right, you send it out to everybody.
Everybody. And Carnegie, by this point, had apparently signaled in some way, and Nasaw notes that no one really knows what he did to signal that he was ready for married life. But by this point, he had, and so he sends it to the single ladies, like, hey, ladies, look at how well-traveled I am and how good I write.
Check out this book.
Yeah, and so one of the people that he sent it to was named Louise Whitfield, and she was the daughter of a successful New York banker who had passed away, and she was pretty cool. I'm a fan of Louise Whitfield, who, spoiler alert, goes on to become Louise Carnegie later in life, but she was 23 years old. She was the head of her household, basically raising her 4-year-old brother because her mother was still alive, but she was ill, and so she was pretty much confined to her bed most of the time. And like I said, she was kind of the head of the house, which, she was very wealthy, socialite New York lady, and so she had plenty of people helping her take care of the house, but still, for a 23-year-old to kind of run the family is impressive to me. One fun fact I found about her was that one Mary McLeod was a maid in the home of Louise Whitfield Carnegie at age 18, within a year of her immigration. That's Mary Ann McLeod's immigration to the United States. Mary Ann McLeod would go on to become Mary Ann Trump, the mother of one Donald Trump.
What?
Yeah.
Stop. No, that's not possible.
That is true. Now, I probably need to specify that Mary McLeod was not working for the Whitfields at this point. Mary Ann Trump was not born until 1912. And so at some point, she worked for Louise Carnegie.
Ah, gotcha. Okay, that makes sense. I was going to say, woo, she's
ancient.
Yeah. Now, they begin this courtship in 1880, and they bond over, horseback riding through Central Park and also over literature. But there's one big problem: age.
Andrew's mother liked Louise quite a bit, and she got along with Louise's mother as well. But Andrew was like in his 40s, I believe, at this point, and Mag wanted him to marry someone who was closer to him in age. Like we said, Louise was only 23.
Moving back to business, in the 1880s, the Edgar Thomson Steelworks revenues exploded, making it by far the most profitable of Andrew's sort of business possessions. Now, the Carnegie Brothers and Company Limited was established on April 1st, 1881. Tom Carnegie and Henry Phipps had been shouldering most of Andrew's business affairs while he gallivanted across Europe and the rest of the world.
Took in the culture.
Right, which doesn't seem all that fair, I guess.
I mean, it was his money.
That's true. Now, during this time, the Carnegie brothers redistributed the equity of their joint ventures more evenly, I guess.
Yeah, so the impression I got was that Phipps and Carnegie were like, listen, Andrew, we know that you financed all this stuff, but also you haven't done anything, and we have. And they had been partners in like smaller deals,
Yeah.
but they didn't own much of the Edgar Thomson Steelworks. And so they were like, how about we, reshuffle some of this?
Right.
And so they basically put all of their assets into one pot.
And then shuffled it up.
Yeah, which was the Carnegie Brothers and Company Limited.
But Andrew ends up with 54%. Right?
Again, I mean, most of the assets were his.
That's true. So that's fair enough.
Yeah, so basically what this was designed to do was to give them a bigger cut of the Thomson Steelworks, which was making the bulk of the money.
Right, so Tom and Phipps, they end up with about 18% each, which made them very wealthy.
Oh, yeah. Do not misunderstand us. Tom and Phipps were doing the majority of the work, but they were also very wealthy people. So
right.
They were not like Andrew's underling slaves.
So the rest of the money is distributed amongst, family, friends, and
other people who had been party to some of these investments as well. So now we're going to introduce another character who any of you who are familiar with this story or are familiar with Pittsburgh basically will recognize. One Henry Clay Frick. I like to think of him as like the anti-Carnegie. They were very similar. They were both very small, self-made men. But where Andrew was very energetic and happy, Frick always seemed to be angry, according to Nasaw. He was also 14 years younger than Carnegie, but they also had several similarities. And Frick had become a very wealthy and successful man running these Coke fields, which did business with the Carnegie brothers because Coke was a fuel source for the Edgar Thomson Steelworks. So Frick wanted to grow his business but didn't have the capital to do it. So he actually approached the Carnegie brothers about selling them 11% of the company and cutting them a favorable rate on Coke for their steel production in exchange for that much-needed cash infusion in 1882. By 1884, they actually had purchased half of the company, and by 1888, they owned 76%, which I thought was kind of interesting that they just took more and more and more. It was funny, though, because after purchasing that initial 11% in 1882, Andrew immediately writes to Robert Garrett, who was the vice president of Baltimore and Ohio Railroad, stating that he'd purchased half. And if Garrett didn't cut them a better deal on the shipping for their products, he would be shipping his massive amounts of Coke exclusively on the Pennsylvania Railroad. So total bluff, but he turned around and got a more favorable deal for himself. And it was funny, too, because if I recall correctly, the reason that it was so expensive for him to ship on that railroad was because most of the time these railroads would ship a car of whatever they were carrying and then reload it and then ship it back. And so they were kind of making money both ways. But in the case of this Coke, for whatever reason, wherever they were going, there was nothing to bring back. So they're not making money on the return trip.
So he purchased that in 1882. But before that, in 1881, he decided that he was going to build his first American library as a gift to the steelworkers at the Edward Thomson Steelworks. This kind of came about by a weird happenstance. one of the reverends in the local area was upset because his parishioners were never able to attend service on Sunday.
Because they were working.
Yeah, they're always stuck at the factory working. So he shows up one day and says, listen, I need to talk to you guys about all this. And the compromise that he makes with the manager that's working, was it Mr. Thompson?
No, so it was a guy named Captain Jones.
Captain Jones.
Which is a great name.
So Captain Jones talks to this reverend, and they come down with a compromise, and he says, hey, will you at least build these guys a reading room so that they can read the Bible? And I guess Andrew says, you know what? Once he found out about this, I'll do you one better. I'll build an entire library. So despite the fact that Andrew wasn't really religious, he had recently been attending services put on by what we call Swedenborgian. Is that right?
I guess that's what we can go with. He had been a Swedenborgian, if you can call him that, or affiliated with one anyway. He had attended a few in Scotland, I believe, and I guess whenever he did go to church in the United States, that's the one he did. And real quick, for those of you who don't know what a Swedenborgian is, it is informed by the writings of scientist and Swedish Lutheran theologian Emanuel Swedenborg, who lived from 1688 to 1772. He claimed to have received a new revelation from Jesus Christ through continuous heavenly visions, which he experienced over a period of at least 25 years. In his writings, he predicted that God would replace the traditional Christian church, establishing a new church, which would worship God in one person, Jesus Christ. The new church doctrine is that each person must actively cooperate in repentance, reformation, and regeneration of one's life.
So, by doing certain deeds like this, hooking up his workers with libraries, he had a pretty good relationship with the unions.
Yeah, we had mentioned before, we talked about it, so we don't need to go super deep right now, but at the time, the reaction from many of these industrialists was the hard ruling with an iron fist when it came to these unions, and it was like a very contentious relationship. But Andrew was like, hey, let's be friends. And the union that was at the Edgar Thomson Steelworks was called the Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers. And this really worked to Andrew's advantage because in having a decent relationship with Andrew, they kind of had high expectations. And when Andrew's only competition for steel in Pittsburgh, which was called the Pittsburgh Bessemer Steel Company, they went to war with the Amalgamated. And the Amalgamated was like, hey, Carnegie's over here treating us real good, so we're not letting up on you. And they basically crushed the Bessemer Steel Company. Through strikes and protests, they more or less went out of business.
So Carnegie consistently stayed on their good side.
Yeah.
As best he could.
Yeah, and then we're about to wrap up here, but just to not lose the personal life in the shuffle of business, he had continued to court Louise, but was constantly traveling. In 1882, he finally professed his love and his intention to marry. She was 25 years old, and he was 49, but it's important to remember that because of Mag, he didn't want this to get out. He didn't want Mag to know because he knew she would be very upset. It was kind of like, once Mag is like out of the picture, we'll get married. And so this was kind of like a secret engagement.
How you gonna do that to Mama?
Hey, man, he was doing what he wanted, but he was still trying to be respectful to Mom.
Gotcha.
That's right. He was too busy taking care of her. All of her needs were met, Melvin.
I was going to say, you can't really be upset. Listen, my kids give me, millions of dollars and put me up in the nicest living quarters in the world.
They can lie to me about who they're going to marry.
Lie to me. I'm okay.
That's right. But yeah, that's where we'll pick up next week. Melvin, real quick before we go, do you want to remind the people, if they find value in what we're doing here at the Life of X, how they can support the show?
The best way to support us is to head on over to our webpage at thelifeofxpodcast.com and click through our support page. You'll find links to Amazon, Patreon. What else am I missing?
Our Audible.
Yes.
Yes, if you don't know what Audible is, it's fantastic. It's audiobook subscription service. If you go through us, we get a small kickback from them.
And you get
a free audiobook, a fantastic audiobook such as Andrew Carnegie by David Nasaw. Go. Yeah. Thank you so much for tuning in. We will see you next week for The Life of Andrew Carnegie, Part 3.
Good day, Sir Madams.